Awesome. Really appreciate that. Um, I'm going to provide a visual description for folks on the call who might need that. I am a fat, white, masculine, center woman. I'm short with short hair. It's kind of pompadoured. I've got gold rimmed glasses on, and I'm wearing a floral button up for folks who might need it. I'm joined by one of Leeway's incredible staff members, Gabe Laredo, on the call, who will introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, my name is Gabe. I'm the program assistant here at Leeway. I use they, them pronouns. I identify as non-binary. I have short, dark hair and a yellow shirt. And I'm in kind of a dark office, but that's because the overhead lighting makes me feel a little funny. I'm gonna pass it on to Naila Francis, who's joining us today as a previous Leeway grantee. Naila, can you please introduce yourself to folks with your pronouns, visual description, and can you talk to us a little bit about your artistic practice and about the project that you got awarded the ACG for in 2023?
Sure. Thank you, Gabe. So my name is Naila Francis. I use she, her pronouns. I am a Black woman, short black hair, purpley rimmed glasses. I forget what color they actually are, but I think there's purple in there. And I am in a background with a yellow wall wearing a flowered shirt. And my artistic practice, even though it might not sound off the bat like an artistic practice, is really as a grief tender. So I provide grief support and care for people both one-on-one and in community. But what I really wanted to do if I got the Leeway grant was that I have a collective that I founded called Salt Trails, and we invite people into a communal experience of grieving. So creating grief spaces where grief is public and visible and shared and honored in order to sort of destigmatize the way grieving is done in this culture. Um, Bringing a very, what I like to call soulful approach to grief, because it's taking it out of the clinical setting and using art and ritual and music and poetry and drumming and just creating a different container for people to experience and explore their grief, and to also invite in the awareness that grief is about so much more than the death of a loved one. And so I had this idea that I wanted to bring this sort of framework for grief that was introduced by a psychotherapist named Francis Weller in his book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. He has this framework called the Five Gates of Grief. And from the moment I heard about the Five Gates of Grief, always was sort of like thinking, like, how can I bring this into a tangible physical experience for people to actually move through these gates? And so the gates are everything we love, we lose,
Mm.
the places that have not known love. So the parts of us that we sort of like banish or send to the margins of our lives because we've been made to feel ashamed of them, or we've been judged for them, or whatever parts of ourselves has not experienced love and acceptance in our lives that we sort of push away. The third gate being the sorrows of the world. The fourth gate, what we expected we did not receive, which is really that we expected to be born into a village. We expected to be born into nurturing community where we would feel affirmed and connected, not just to each other, but sort of to the wider natural world and the cosmos. And most of us come into this world and we're lucky if we have just one pair of eyes to greet us, much less the village and the communal experience of being held. And then the fifth gate being ancestral grief, which is the grief, not only the grief passed down through our lineages, but also all the unmetabolized grief that's just sort of in the land, baked into the culture from hundreds of years of unacknowledged violence and theft and rupture and all the ills that we are now seeing made manifest in a bigger way in society. The project was called The Five Gates of Grief, and I partnered with another collective called Threshold to sort of bring the project to life. Use
Mm.
art and ritual. And we invited 6 artists. Two of them worked together on one gate, but to interpret their vision of the gates, which they did with art and music and clowning and um, invitations to the public to also explore different sort of like craft pieces or writing pieces around their grief. And it was a 3-day event that we did, inviting people to experience these gates.
Nyla, excuse me, I'm sorry. I'm just like always blown away when you talk about the intention behind your work and the ways in which grief is a space of care and a space of power. And so just thank you for your work. We're definitely going to hear more about it. We're going to ask you lots of questions about it tonight. Um, and not only what inspired it, but how you talked about this beautiful big project in the confines of a grant application, right? And so in 1,500 characters per question, right? How you poured all of that into this application so that the panel who makes these decisions could feel it and want to support it. So thank you so much. Um, we're going to focus on the Art and Change grant. Leeway has a couple different grant programs that run. Tonight's focus is on what we call the ACG lovingly. It's just an abbreviation for the Art and Change grant. But if at any point during our conversation tonight you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Feel free to come off mute, raise your hand, and we'll do our best to answer those questions. You can find more about the Art and Change grant on our webpage. I just dropped the link in the chat, but we're really going to break it down for you verbally tonight so that we're doing that hard work and you don't have to dig through the guidelines. You can also email us at any time. Our emails are on our website. They're public, they're free. You can email info@leeway.org with any general questions, and also you can just contact Gabe or I, and we're here to support you. The other thing I want to mention before we dig in is that Leeway staff really are here to support you in a myriad of ways. I just dropped a link in the chat for one-on-one applicant support sessions. Because Leeway staff do not make the decisions, we do not decide who gets these grants. We can get into the weeds of your application with you. We can provide one-on-one applicant support. You can bring a draft, we can give feedback, or you can just bring an idea and have a thought partner on that idea. Whatever works best for you, we'll meet you wherever you're at in terms of that support. So we've got upcoming sessions on, well, we have one on Friday that has closed already, but if you need support, let us know. And then we have other dates on the 22nd and the 29th of July, but you're welcome to ask for a session whenever, and we'll do our best to meet you where you're at. Gabe, if you'll click to the next slide.
Yeah, and I also just want to jump in real quick and say that we will be sending a follow-up email after this session with all of the links you might need, with a link to this recording. And so don't worry about losing access to this session. Like, we will be sending you these materials afterwards.
Thanks, Jay. If you're unfamiliar with Leeway, just a quick blurb about who we are. We are serious about supporting women, trans, and gender nonconforming artists working in the communities at the intersection of art, culture, and social change. We fund artists living in the greater Philadelphia region. We consider that Bucks County, Camden County, Chester, Delaware, Montgomery, and Philadelphia counties. We give grants to individuals, individual artists and collectives, but we do not fund 501c3s or LLCs. And so a lot of grants are earmarked for nonprofits. Leeway's resources are for individual artists or collectives that are working sort of independently. We currently accept applications in English and Spanish, and so on our website you'll see access to both of those applications in those languages. But if you should need an application in another language or have need accessibility supports, you just let us know. We're here to support. Next slide. The other thing that comes up from time to time, we use this term art for social change a lot. And essentially all that art for social change means for us is that it has a vision and an intentional analysis, right? It impacts not just you, because you could be doing some transformative painting in your basement, right? But how does that transformation or that change ripple out besides just you as the artist who's creating it, right? And so we really think about art for social change as art that engages and impacts community in some way, shape, or form, right? There's no monolithic definition or one size fits all way of of understanding what art for social change is. It could raise consciousness. It could reclaim traditional practices. It could fight racism or sexism or transphobia. It could be a tool for movement organizing. It doesn't have to do all those things. It could do one of those things, and that's still enough. But the two big questions are really ask yourself as you prepare for any Leeway application is how does your art create action and how does it engage and impact the community? If you boiled our app down to the core, those would be the two questions. How's your art create action and how does it engage the community? Just going to do a temperature check. I know, Naila, you couldn't see the slides, but could other folks see the slides as well? Or could not? Just 1 second and we'll pivot. Naila, you good? Awesome.
Awesome. Thank you for letting us know.
Gotta love tech. Yeah. At any point, if you have a tech issue, let us know. We'll try to solve it. Also, on this slide, you'll see a couple pictures from Naila's beautiful project. Naila, in like a minute or two, could you give us just a breakdown of what we're seeing in these three photos?
Sure. So the bottom photo is everyone who was involved in the project. So that's Salt Trails, the collective that I founded, am a part of, Threshold Collective, and all of the artists who were involved in creating the gates. The photo to your top right is of one of the artists, Jordan Deal, who created this insane, I don't even know how he did it, this situation with the chairs stacked all around each other to sort of frame his piano and had these beautiful little like tucked in altar pieces remembering loved ones because he had the gate, everything we love, we lose. And then the next photo is from the Ancestral Grief Gate, where we had an artist who he's a clown among many other things. So he did a clowning piece, but he also had all these invitations at his ritual space to invite people to reflect on and consider what the ancestral grief is that they're holding.
Thank you for that breakdown. You know, sometimes, especially when you're talking about multidisciplinary work, sometimes it can be hard to write about or envision in a grant application. And one of the things that you did really well, Naila, was you talked about what those intersections would look like. Can you tell us a little bit about why you applied for a Leeway grant? Like what inspired you to do that? You had this idea, but why this grant?
I, well, one, I attended this session um, in Camden the year that I applied, and it was really, really inspiring to hear. Misty Soul was the grantee at the time, and it was really inspiring to hear her talk about her project. And I also remember you, Melissa, saying something to the effect of like, this is the gentlest grant application that's out there. And this was the first grant I had ever applied for. So I was like, okay, if I'm gonna go for a grant, this is the one. But I also really loved all the different intentions that the grant supported because to me, grief work is such radical work, is work that invites cultural and social change, is work that, you know, straddles so many lines of like justice work, economic justice, housing justice, health justice. Like it really just felt like if I wanted to bring this project to life and bring grief sort of out of the shadows in a way that it could be recognized more as like radical, necessary, vital work for our times, that this was the grant to help me do that.
I'm so glad it was too, truly and wholeheartedly. Um, Naila, you're incredible, but Misty Soul, you just brought into the room. Misty is an incredible Leeway grantee as well, multiple grantee winner, multiple different grants, and I just plopped Misty's information into the chat if you're curious. Does lots of really cool stuff. Next slide, please. So you might be thinking about like, what do we fund and who decides? Earlier, I talked a little bit about that grant decisions are not made by Leeway staff or board. 100% of our decision-making power sits with community artists. So folks like you who are out here doing the damn thing on the street with people are making these decisions. And so I tell you that not to be like, we don't make the decisions, but because sometimes when you're applying for a grant, you think that you have to take on like some grant speak, right? Or you have to have a certain tone or academic language in order to receive the grant or prove your worth. That is not the case for Leeway. You show up in Leeway's application as who you are and how you would talk to somebody in your home, on the corner, on the bus, whatever, talking about your application, right? Also, Leeway is pretty serious about feedback in terms of understanding why or why not you have received the grant or not received the grant. Feedback is a right, not a luxury. And so if you put your time and energy into applying for a Leeway grant and you check the little box that says, I would like to receive feedback, we're going to make sure that we give you some panel feedback and that it's hopefully generative feedback that you can put in your pocket, whether you come back and apply for Leeway, whether you got the grant or didn't. Because grant writing can be really weird and challenging. And so we're thinking about how it can possibly be generative at the end of the day, whether you get the funds or not get the funds. But let's try and get the funds too, because money is helpful to do the damn thing. The other thing I want you to know is that Leeway funds all different kinds of artistic practices, right? And so this includes the traditional arts, visual artists, dancers, theater makers, but media makers, film, folks. But we also fund what some folks might call non-traditional, or what you just might call art. Hair braiders, aromatherapists, DJs, and everything and the kitchen sink is often how I talk about it. If you consider it an artistic practice and can make the case in your application, then come through. Naila, in terms of coming into this application, some folks might call you a cultural producer, a person who brings together all the artists to do the thing, right? As well as an artist. And so, how did you approach this application in a way that let them understand that that curation was an artistic practice for you, that getting together people to do this thing was art?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it was a little tricky, even just thinking like, oh, do I qualify for something like this? But because of just how you explained it, I was like, yes, I can make this work. And I think, I call a lot of what I do like space holding, but there really is an art to it because it requires creativity. It's not, even though I do this in like the other half of my practice, people do come and they sit with me and we talk and we go over skills, but the actual like creating community grief experiences is an art practice because it requires intention and it requires creativity and it requires thinking about new and different ways that we can get people to access their grief and to feel supported and cared for in that. And when I first even just had a vision for Salt Trails and what I wanted to do, it was this idea of a grief processional. And I just kept pushing it away because I was like, well, I don't even know where this is coming from. This is not meant for me because it was so out of the box and it felt like such an artistic thing. And I think um, that was the same sort of energy that drove me to want to envision these five gates. And of course, there was also the fact that I needed artists, actual like artist making art to be part of this project.
Yeah. You were the visionary, right? You were the person with the connections to bring all the right people together into the space and had the idea and the vision for how to implement it, right? It was bigger than just like I sent some emails and I put a spreadsheet together, right? Like you were a visionary in this work and made the case that you would be so. You also received panel feedback. Can you talk just a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I pestered Gabe a lot, but they were so generous and kind. And when Leeway says, like, use us, They really, really mean it because I know that, I submitted, I think, at least two drafts, if not more, of my application to Gabe, and we met and they walked me through, what was helpful, what I could expand upon. Like, remember, you have like character limitations. This is a little long. How can you condense this and be more concise? So it was super, super helpful to receive their feedback.
Thank you. I mean, you just illustrate something beautiful, which is like you can tap us once, twice, three times, however many, At like three, we might ask like, we think you got it. Um, you also got panel feedback when you got your notification letter, right? And so the panel shared some thoughts with you there. Was that helpful to get their feedback, even when you received the grant?
It was helpful because, well, it was helpful because it was kind of affirming. Like, oh, yeah, they really get this vision and get what I'm trying to do. So that was definitely helpful.
Right. At points there were like, there's always like our panels are curious, right? So they're always going to ask questions too. And so they did pose some questions for you, not because they doubted the power. They clearly didn't. They funded it, right? But were any of those questions helpful? And if not, it's real if they weren't.
I think there was a question, yeah, the question about community engagement came up and how were we going to engage the community? And even though we were already thinking about that, that really helped us keep that sort of at the forefront
Mhm.
uh, of the process in creating what we were creating.
Good. Thank you. They will oftentimes, especially if you're working with the community members around a topic that is sensitive or could trigger folk, right? Panels, regardless of who's on them, will often ask the question around like, how are you caring for your people, right? And so just something to think about, especially if you're working around a topic that is challenging, right? Or needs a trauma-informed lens. Get ready to think about how you're caring for the community and how you can talk about that in your application. So just a heads up. Next slide.
All right, I'll jump in now. We've talked a lot about Nyla's project, and now we're gonna kind of talk about specifics about the Art and Change grant and what applying for a project-based grant means. So the ACG awards grants of up to $2,500 to women, trans, and gender nonconforming artists and cultural producers in the greater Philadelphia area to fund art for social change projects, right? And the questions that were lifted up before, how does the art impact community? How does it affect change, right? And so those are kinds of the questions at the core of the project. The deadline is August 1st at 11:59 p.m. And that is for online applications and hard copy applications. Hard copy applications have to be dropped off to Leeway's office or received by Leeway's office by that deadline as well. And just looking at, kind of looking at the numbers of the Art and Change grant, usually 70 to actually 100 people apply for the Art and Change grant every year, and up to 25 projects can be awarded to give you a sense of what your odds might be like, right? In terms of eligibility, you have to be at least 18. You have to live in our funding region, which includes the following counties: Bucks, Camden in New Jersey, Chester, Delaware, Montgo, and Philadelphia. You have to self-identify as a woman, trans, or gender nonconforming person, and you cannot be a full-time student enrolled in an arts degree granting program. So, for example, you can be a full-time student enrolled in a different kind of program that does not have to do with the arts, or you can be a part-time student in an arts degree granting program, but not full-time in an arts program. And then in terms of what the Art and Change grant funds, the types of work that it funds, it's for work that hasn't been done yet, right? So in your application, you are proposing a project that is to be done. You're outlining what the project looks like. You'll provide a budget for the project, and it's something that will take place in the future, right? So we don't fund retroactively. Your project can't have already taken place, and then you're essentially seeking reimbursement funds, right? That's not eligible. But what we could do is fund a piece of your work. So let's say you're working on a long-term project and you're seeking funding for a phase of the work. That is something that you can apply to the Art and Change grant for. In terms of timeline, you will not hear back about the status of your application until 10 to 12 weeks after the deadline. And so keep that in mind when you are crafting your project, when you're coming up with logistics, and when you're coming up with your project start date. We recommend no earlier than October 15th, but even then, I would give yourself some wiggle room just in case, right? And yeah, again, we've touched on this a lot already, but everything that the Art and Change grant supports should be a social change-based art project that impacts a larger group, audience, or community, right? So if you have a project that is working with a very small group of individuals, if it's like a closed group that impacts like 5 folks, that is not going to be, it's not going to be seen as community engaged, as something that's maybe more open to the public, that is in a series. I mean, it can take shape in many different ways, but just keep in mind, like, how is your project affecting change in the community of your choosing, right?
And if it is a small closed group, because we have funded some of those things, right? The there's usually some sort of showcase or public share exhibition, right? Because there have certainly been like, let's take writing workshops or poetry workshops that have been closed because they need to be safe spaces. They're closed for a reason, right? They're only open to this group of folks. Totally fine. But maybe there's a zine that's produced at the end of that or some sort of exhibition that is shared out with the community in some way, shape, or form. So thanks, Gabe, for letting me interrupt.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. All right, so before we get into the application itself, let's talk about social change intents. This is essentially a list of different issue areas that you will be asked to look through and select 1, 2, 3 that best reflect the core intentions of your project, of the project that you're proposing, right? We do not define these for you. We just provide a list and we ask you to like literally check off which 1 to 3 you're selecting. Later on in the application, there is a long form question where you'll be able to speak to how the social change intent or intents that you selected speak to your project, right? And so, for example, cultural preservation or restoration, maybe you are, I don't know, doing some kind of research into some traditional folk practice that like only maybe you have access to, or like you have access to a community that practices like some kind of particular folk art practice. Like that can be an example of cultural preservation or restoration. Maybe you're kind of bringing it to the fore. You're doing some work to kind of preserve the legacy of that practice, right? And yeah, I mean, any 1 to 3 of these, more is not necessarily better. You don't feel like you need to pick 3. We also sometimes see folks pick a lot, like they pick more than 3, with the understanding that like a lot of impactful work does kind of bleed out into multiple issue areas, right? Maybe more than 3. But in terms of like what is at the core of your work, I would kind of try to distill it down when selecting which social change intent best resonates with the project that you're proposing. So Naila, you selected in your application cultural preservation and restoration and economic justice. Can you talk about how your project engaged with those intents and how you chose them?
Yes. And I also will say it was actually really hard for us to narrow it down because we felt like grief could spill across so many of these areas. But I think we settled on cultural preservation and restoration, focusing more on the restoration aspect because we don't really have a culture around grief in this country. And I mean, if we were to say we did, it's kind of like a very unsupported culture that's rooted in the capitalist norms of productivity and individualism and performance and efficiency and profit. And grief is something that really doesn't abide by any of these norms. And so we really wanted to reimagine the way that we do grief and lift up the fact that grieving was always meant to be something done communally and in a collective container. So that was speaking to the cultural preservation or restoration part. And then in terms of like economic justice, we wanted to take like grief support out of the traditional framework of therapy, which so many don't have access to and can't afford, or for whatever reasons, they just don't feel comfortable accessing it. So we wanted to create a space for those who otherwise would not have access to grief support to come and feel validated and supported in their grief, to come and have like, the grief of gun violence acknowledged, the grief of like housing insecurity, like all these other disenfranchised griefs that we don't really talk about as a culture. We wanted to create space for people to like really hold the breadth of their experience of loss and transition and change.
Mm.
That's a really beautiful answer. And I think an incredible example of how you can look at this list and apply these to your project and define them for yourself, right? So to look at cultural preservation and restoration and think about preserving like a traditional art practice is one way of defining that social change intent. But your definition of how do we restore the culture around grieving is just as like valid in this application, right? It is it's something that you have the space to kind of explain yourself, like explain your vision and your understanding of the work that you're doing, right? And later on, Melissa will go through the questions one by one in the application, and we'll talk more about the question that deals with these social change intents.
You know what I loved about you, Nyla, is you were honest when you answered question number 3, directly ask about your, like, what social change intents do you pick? And you literally wrote in your application, honestly, grief touches every social change category. Like you just were like, you said exactly in your application what you just said here. And so you were really honest and direct, and the panel appreciated that. So.
Thank you for that.
All right, so now we're going to actually dive into the application. One of the first questions that you will see is a request for a short project description. It's essentially your elevator pitch. It's like 2 to 5 sentences, if that, just giving us a brief overview of the who, what, and why of the project, right? You'll talk about what the art form is, who is being featured in the work, or who the work is being created for, and why you're creating it, right? And so, Nyla, I'm going to share your short project description with folks because I think it's a great example that hits on all of those points, and leaves us curious, right? And gives you space to then go more in depth in the rest of your application. The 5 Gates of Grief is a 3-day multidisciplinary interactive experience centered around grief awareness and support for individuals and communities with limited access and resources to grief care. By inviting disenfranchised grievers into a communal experience of expressing their losses through creative expression, we are offering an inclusive grief space that subverts established cultural ideas around grief and loss as a private, insular experience to be moved through quickly. And so, we've been hearing you kind of talk about your intention and vision behind the project. And so I think these 2 sentences really distill all of those ideas down into something digestible and immediately understandable, right? We know what the art form is. It's going to be a 3-day multidisciplinary experience centering grief awareness, right? And that sentence kind of then gives you the space to go deeper into explaining what that experience looks like in the rest of the application. We know who is being featured in the work, right? People with limited access and resources to grief care. And we understand why it's being created, to offer an inclusive grief space, subverting ideas around grief and loss as this private insular experience. And so, yeah, I think that's a great elevator pitch, and we'll talk later about how that's kind of the rest of the application builds on that. Um, Nyla, can I ask you, how did you boil your project down and everything you've been saying? How did you boil it down into these two sentences?
I think it was really, yeah, the what. What is it actually that we're doing here?
Mhm.
And then what is the impact? Like that's how I tried to get to sort of like the nugget of what it was, because I'm sure that I had a much wordier answer that I had to distill.
Did it go through a few different drafts?
Yeah, definitely went through multiple drafts of this answer. Yeah. Because yeah, I wanted to get in, like, I remember being very much in the weeds at one point. Like, I need to talk about the artist and I need to talk about the gates. And it was like, no, what is the impact of this project that you want to create?
Right. Yeah, you got right down to like the not the bare bones of the project, but like what's the standout of the project, the impact that it's going to have, the purpose behind it, right? And you did that in two sentences really beautifully that kind of led the way, paved the way for more in-depth discussion about these ideas and what the experience was going to look like in the application.
Yeah, it was like a beautiful appetizer. If you like a metaphor and a cheesy metaphor I'm about to give you one right now, it was a really beautiful appetizer for the rest of the meal of your application, right? So you just got to get them interested in wanting to learn more. They're going to read your application, no doubt, right? But you want them invested so that they turn the page. Every piece of your application is like a chapter in a book. You want them to finish the book with you, you know? If we go to the next slide, I'll talk about the next chapter in this application, which we call the experience page. And so Leeway doesn't ask for an artist resume or CV. Instead, we ask for something called the experience page, which is 4 to 10 personal, professional, or political experiences that have led you to your work today as an artist. To be honest, this is pretty different from a lot of other funders where there's an upload button for your portfolio or your CV or resume. If Leeway wanted a resume or a CV, we would ask for a resume or a CV. We really want you to think beyond just the accolades that you would see on a resume. We need some of those too, right? Those help prove to the panel that you've got the artistic chops to do the thing, right? That you have some experience doing whatever it is that you're proposing to do, right? But they're also interested in what led you to this point where you're proposing this project, right? Um, it's also really thinking about how do you pull the curtain back and show the panel a little bit about who you are and who is beyond this project. You know, it's a minimum of 4. I encourage you to use the space if you have it, quite honestly, because it's a competitive grant, and give the panel a sense of who you are and who's spearheading this work. Also, I'd highly recommend on your experience page, it's going to look like you have a small amount of space, right? But you have 325 characters to play with, friends. That is like 2 to 3 sentences. Fill that space if you need to explain it, right? So something that looks like I attended the Allied Media Conference. Okay, cool. You went to a conference. All right, that doesn't really say much to the panel, especially if they don't know what the Allied Media Conference is, right? But if you say and add a little more context to that and say, I attended the Allied Media Conference and it was the first time I got to share my work with other media makers for change. Suddenly, especially if you're doing media-based work, right? It's starting to make sense why that would be on your experience page, right? There's no right or wrong experience here. However, we recommend that your experiences, especially one which you'll pull out to talk more in depth called the highlighted experience, is the most compelling in terms of your relationship to your project. Nyla, can you talk a little bit about how you approach the experience page? It was really powerful to read yours.
Thank you. Yeah, I actually really enjoyed this part because it gave me a chance, which I don't often get, to reflect on the why of the work that I do. So I shared a couple experiences, and they were all pretty personal. That I came to this grief work through my dad dying in a hospital where he didn't receive the best care because we couldn't afford private care at the time, and that's how I started doing grief work. And I talked about being the only Black woman at the time. I was working a corporate job and being the only Black woman on this all-white team at the time when George Floyd was murdered. And, when I expressed my grief, their response was to like shuttle me over to a team of like Black creators working on Black products instead of like really just listening to my grief and like affirming what I was feeling. And I talked about how I came to form salt trails. I talked about having this experience with these gray whales in Mexico. And they were almost hunted to extinction years ago. But here I was having this experience with these whales, like coming up to our boats and being so gentle and wanting our touch, and how that really rocked me with unexpected grief. I didn't expect that to be a grief experience, but like the grief of our disconnection and the way that we don't like approach nature with the reverence and humility that we should. And I also talked about spending time in an orphanage in Tanzania and how that was a really powerful experience for me to see how much joy these children had while living in such what we would consider abysmal conditions, but also facing the grief of like, why are there hundreds of orphanages across Tanzania? What are the structures and the systems that are failing that keep children in these places?
Wow. The thing about you that I will forever appreciate is like you're not scared to go deep. And I really appreciate that about you. You were like, I have 10 SWATs. Here you go. This is who I am. And you did it really skillfully because you thought about what are the personal things around grief that have led me here, right? So they got to know you a little bit and they got to know your story. And then you also thought about what are the professional things around grief that I've been doing, right? Like creating salt trails, and this sort of collective around grieving, which even if you didn't name it like this, allowed them to understood that you could hold space for grief and had done so and facilitated spaces like that before. And so it spoke volumes about the chops that you had to do this project. So thank you for being vulnerable and for sharing all that in the experience page. It really truly helped them see you. Next slide, please. All right, the application questions. My friends, there are 6 of them. All right. Here's how I feel about all grant questions. You're like, well, they're grant questions and they feel infinitely challenging to answer sometimes, right? But I want to try and break them down a little bit for you in the next 5 minutes, as one can in 5 minutes. And so, in terms of the first question, it's going to ask you to summarize your Art for Social Change project and consider the who, what, when, and where of the project. And so earlier we were talking about Naila's short description. This is the place where Naila expanded on what she meant by multidisciplinary and interactive, right? This is where Naila talked about sound and movement, and it was going to be inside and outside this space, right? Like Naila did this beautiful thing where she got really specific in question 1 about what the art and the event look like, right? There's going to be time in this application, in other questions, to talk about the theory, right? The social change intent. But the thing to really think about in question number 1 is the who, what, where, why, and when. What's the art look like? There's no work sample here. And so really explain things. If you're going to talk about doing a series of paintings, right? If you're a visual artist, how many paintings? What are they about? Are they portraits? Are they landscapes? Are they realistic? Are they abstract? What's the scale of the paintings? Are they small? Are they huge? Really help the panel paint a picture of what the art will look like, in terms of the project that you're proposing. The second question is the one that I often say is the easiest to answer, because if you're attending a grant session, you know why the project is important to you and why it's urgent to happen, right? So what's motivating you to do this work? And then in terms of the second part around urgency, why does this work need to be funded now, right? They're going to have a lot of applications in front of them, but why fund this thing that you're proposing right now in 2025? What is happening, not just for you personally, but for the community as to why they need this project that you're supporting? What's happening socioeconomically, even, that might be worth thinking about in terms of helping them say yes to funding your project. Question number three is going to ask about the goals of your project and then how the art will create action, particularly around the social change intents that you selected, right? So this is why it really matters what you choose, right? If you choose cultural preservation and economic justice in the same way that Naila did, you're going to need to talk about cultural preservation and economic justice here and how your work has a goal or creates some change around those social change areas, right? Not just for you, but for the community at large. The one thing that Naila did that I always appreciate in a grant application is you were really direct, Naila. You said, my goals are this. And you literally said A, B. Like, I really appreciated how clear that was, right? You also said, my project focuses on cultural preservation and economic justice by doing XYZ thing, right? I get it. I'm a poet sometimes too, but a grant application is usually not the place for a poem in answering these questions. And being direct and specific is the ticket in a grant application, at least for this one. Question number four asks you to define your community, and the emphasis is your community, and what relationship, like what's your relationship to the community that you'll work with on this project, right? This question is really asking you to consider, who are you? Question you at the end of the day. And what are the different intersections of your identity, and how might that play a role in the work? I oftentimes refer to this as like the Audre Lorde question, because Audre Lorde was so clear about naming her intersections as her spaces of power. I am woman, mother, lesbian, poet, warrior, and the list goes on depending on when you're engaging with Audre Lorde's work, right? And so what are the different intersections of your identity, and how might they play a role in the work, right? Are you working are you from the community you're working in? Might be a question to consider. You certainly can work outside of your own community, but if you're an elder and you're working with youth, the panel might have questions around how the youth have agency if you're not part of that youth yourself, right? You might be queer, gender nonconforming, documenting queer, gender nonconforming communities, but just because you have the same identity as somebody doesn't mean that they want you there, right? And so be clear about how you'll connect with folks. And this is when question number five comes in. Question number four is all about, who are you in your intersections? How does it influence? Question number five is, how does the project engage the communities you're working with? And so you've told us a little bit about yourself and how it influences the project. In five, you're talking about your community and how they are actually engaging with the project that you're talking about, right? The easiest trap here for question number five is to say, my community is for everyone. Everyone is in my community. I get it. Your work can totally speak to everyone, right? But who do you hope comes or engages with this work? Who are you creating your work for? Specifics really matter here. Otherwise, if you're not clear on your audience or your community, the panel will oftentimes ask questions around that. And so don't fall into that trap. Be as specific as possible. And if you're doing work outside of the Philadelphia region, that some of this project will engage not in the Philadelphia area, how will you bring that work back to Philadelphia will be the question that they will ask usually. And then the last question is about a change partner. And a change partner is any person, organization, or business that can support your project in some way, shape, or form. A change partner answers three questions about you as part of this application process. They actually have a separate form or piece of the application that they do. And so be really thoughtful about who you ask to be your change partner because they will endorse or not endorse you in this project. Naila, how did you approach answering these 6 questions as you tackled them?
Ah, I probably pulled my hair out, honestly, at first. And exactly what you said. I had to get out of because I am a poet and a writer, I had to get out of trying to make it sound pretty and nice and be like, okay, what, like almost scientific isn't the word, but just like very like matter of fact and like, okay, I need to be very clear and I need to be very direct and what are the examples, and not try to. I also, as you said, I like to go deep. I also tend to come from a very like emotional space about why we need things. And I had to like just sort of rein myself in and really be pointed, and concise in my answers.
I appreciate that. Like, I will oftentimes when I'm doing a grant application being like, oh, I really love that line that I just wrote. And then I'll be like, but is it answering the question? Like, have I answered the question? And like 9 times out of 10, I haven't. Let's be real. I just liked how it sounded. So really strip it down. And I appreciate that advice that you just gave folks. Next slide. I just hinted a little bit at a change partner. Again, some person or organization or business that has some connection to your project. It can be a venue that's providing free space. It could be PhillyCam if you need media equipment and you're filming something. It could be your next door neighbor who's lived on the block for 45 years and you're doing a project on gentrification and they have the knowledge you need as your change partner. It can really be anybody or place that can best support you. Nyla, can you tell us just a little bit about who your change partner was?
Yes, so my change partner was the Moss Building in Kensington because obviously I needed a space to have this experience. And they were willing to provide the space. And it was also, their location was also perfect because we wanted that community, of disenfranchised grievers who were affected by gun violence and drug addiction and all these other things. And they sort of had been rooted in the community for many years and had connections to a lot of organizations doing the work that we wanted to support.
I love that. In the community you were already wanting to engage with. Love that beautiful through line that you gave there. The important thing for a change partner is not only that they have to be able to support you, right? And fill out 3 questions about you, but they cannot financially benefit, right? And so your change partner cannot be a line in your budget. We want them to support you for the right reasons, not just because you're giving them a budget line. And so really take that into consideration as you choose your change partner. You can certainly put whatever you want in your budget. You can pay other people, you can pay yourself. Nyla paid all or most of her collaborators. It was the bulk of your project budget. But you cannot pay your change partner. So be thoughtful when you're there. Next slide as we start to wind it down. Ooh, in like 1 minute, I'm going to talk about the what I would call the easiest project budgeting grant applications that I've ever seen, but it's still a budget, and budgets give us anxiety from time to time. And so, tips for budget, you can clump things together. And what I mean by that is you don't have to tell us about every dollar and cent of this $2,500 that you're going to potentially receive, right? We know this is for work that is not happening yet, and so your budget will likely change, right? But give an idea of what your budget will support. And your budget will tell a story about who and what you value in this project. And so, Nyla, your budget was 3 items, right? Literally 3 things, and that was totally fine, right? It was paying the artist and compensating them for their materials, marketing and outreach, and food and drink for opening night, right? And so you boil it down to like, these are the 3 big buckets I have. And it is totally fine because it painted a picture about who and what you value. and what you had already talked about earlier in the application. How did you decide that it was just those three things, Nyla?
Well, I mean, we really believe in paying artists, so that was sort of priority paramount to us that the artists got paid for their time and what they were creating. And then we needed to create flyers. We wanted to reach out, to as many people as we could. So that was also important. And then we wanted the opening night to feel special. We didn't want people to just show up and like walk through and then that's it. We wanted there to be, because part of this whole experience was to make it feel like there was room to like engage and talk to people and have conversations. So we wanted people to linger and gather and talk about what they were seeing. And so it was important to make the opening night feel special with food and drink and really make it a community gathering space.
Thank you. And it painted a picture for the panel. Your budget can exceed $2,500. That's okay. But there will be a question about if your budget exceeds this amount, what will this grant specifically support? And so be ready if it exceeds 2,500 to paint a picture on, hey, this 2,500 will support editors, or this 2,500 will support workshops, or whatever it is that the grant will support. Last slide.
Can I also offer really quick? I suggest that the story of your budget should match the story of that you're telling in the written questions, right? So if you're talking about creating a zine and then all of a sudden in the project budget, there's a line for videography, that's fine, but give us context as to why that videography is needed, right? Like, so no surprises in the budget would be my like quick suggestion at the end here.
Great advice. And this is just saying, we're here to help you. We're here to help you. Grants can be intimidating, but let us support you if you need it. Nyla, any parting advice for folks before we wrap it up?
I just want to echo what you said, which is really be you. And I remember Misty saying that in her presentation as well. Like this, you don't have to put on a persona. You don't have to like, try to like think like, oh, what do they want to hear? But really be your authentic self and let your passion for your project shine through.
I love that. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Nyla. Thank you to everybody who hung in there with us. Whoo, you gave us an extra 4 minutes. Thank you so much. And we are here we'll be here for another 5-7 minutes to answer any questions Gabe and I can support with. Other than that, and we can answer any questions beyond that on another day too. Thank you all so much. Good luck with your applications and let us know what you might need. And here's our emails. Read them. Are there any questions that we can answer right now before we wrap?